In a small, quiet town nestled in the southern part of the United States, life moved at a slow pace. The streets were lined with old oak trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. On the surface, it seemed like a peaceful place where everyone knew each other. But beneath this calm exterior lay deep-rooted prejudices that had been passed down through generations. Racism wasn't something people talked about openly, but it lingered in subtle ways. In the way some store owners watched black customers more closely, or how certain neighborhoods remained unwelcoming to families of color. Every Friday morning, the local courthouse became the center of attention. It was here that Judge Thomas Harrington held court, and his reputation preceded him. To some, he was a strict but fair judge who upheld the law without compromise. To others, especially those from marginalized communities, he was a man whose biases often bled into his rulings. Over the years, stories circulated about how he treated defendants differently based on the color of their skin. Some said he handed out harsh sentences to black individuals for minor offenses, while giving lighter punishments to white offenders committing similar crimes. Yet no one dared to confront him directly. After all, challenging a judge meant risking retaliation, whether overt or hidden. On one such Friday, the courtroom buzzed with its usual energy. Friends, family members, and curious bystanders filled the wooden benches, whispering among themselves as they waited for the proceedings to begin. Among them sat Marcus Johnson, a 24-year-old black man with dreams bigger than the town he called home. Marcus wanted to become an electrician, a goal he'd been working toward tirelessly despite the obstacles life threw his way. He had recently completed a training program and was eager to start his career. But today, instead of focusing on wiring diagrams or job applications, Marcus found himself standing nervously in front of Judge Harrington, accused of resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. The trouble began earlier that week, when Marcus was pulled over for speeding. At first, it seemed like a routine traffic stop. The officer asked for his license and registration, which Marcus promptly provided. But then, things took a turn. The officer claimed he smelled marijuana coming from the car and demanded to search it. Marcus, knowing he hadn't broken any laws, politely questioned why a search was necessary without probable cause. What followed was a heated exchange that ended with Marcus being handcuffed and taken to the station. No drugs were found during the search, but the charges stuck anyway. As Marcus stood in the courtroom, dressed in his best suit, a navy blue jacket and neatly pressed slacks, he tried to steady his breathing. His mother, seated in the front row, gripped her purse tightly, her eyes filled with worry. Marcus's attorney, a kind but overworked public defender named Ms. Reynolds, leaned close to him and whispered words of encouragement. "Stay calm," she said softly. "We'll get through this." Judge Harrington entered the room shortly afterward, his robes flowing behind him as he walked to the bench. He glanced around the courtroom, his sharp gaze landing briefly on Marcus before moving on. When he finally spoke, his voice carried authority and disdain. "Marcus Johnson," he began, flipping through the papers in front of him. "You're here today because you decided to challenge law enforcement during what should have been a simple traffic stop. Is that correct?" Marcus swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. Harrington raised an eyebrow, seemingly amused by Marcus's response. "Let me tell you something, Mr. Johnson," he continued, leaning forward slightly. "When an officer asks you to step out of your vehicle, you don't argue. You comply. That's how civilized people behave." His tone was condescending, dripping with mockery that made Marcus's cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. The judge paused for effect, letting his words hang in the air. Then, with a theatrical sigh, he added, "And let's not forget your history. I see here that you were cited for loitering 2 years ago." "Loitering?" He laughed dryly, shaking his head as if Marcus's past mistakes somehow invalidated his entire character. "What kind of message does that send to our community? That breaking rules is acceptable?" The comment drew murmurs from the crowd. Some nodded approvingly, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus clenched his fists but forced himself to remain silent. Arguing back would only make things worse. He could feel the weight of the judge's prejudice pressing down on him, suffocating yet impossible to escape. Harrington wasn't finished. "Now, regarding these current charges," he said, raising his voice slightly, "resisting arrest and disorderly conduct are serious offenses, Mr. Johnson. They undermine the very fabric of order we strive to maintain in this town. And given your attitude during the traffic stop, I find it hard to believe you deserve leniency." At this point, Ms. Reynolds stood up, clearing her throat. "Your Honor, may I remind you that my client has no prior convictions? These allegations stem from a misunderstanding, not malicious intent." Harrington waved her off dismissively. "Misunderstanding, really?" he retorted, his voice rising. "Officer Grayson is a decorated member of our police force. Are we supposed to believe he fabricated these charges?" Ms. Reynolds opened her mouth to respond, but Harrington cut her off. "Enough, I've heard enough." He straightened up, his expression cold and final. "Mr. Johnson, you are guilty on all counts. 6 months in county jail, plus a fine of $500. Court is adjourned." The gavel struck the bench with a sharp crack, echoing through the room like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the audience, and Marcus felt his knees weaken. 6 months? For questioning an officer? It was absurd, unfair, and blatantly unjust. As he turned to look at his mother, tears streaming down her face, Marcus realized this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every person who had ever been wronged by a system designed to protect the powerful while punishing the vulnerable. But just as Harrington prepared to leave the bench, a new voice interrupted the tense silence. "Your Honor," came a firm, commanding tone from the back of the room. All heads turned toward the speaker, a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a dark trench coat. He strode confidently down the aisle, his presence commanding immediate attention. Sunlight streaming through the windows caught the gleam of a badge clipped to his belt. It was Detective Elijah Carter, a seasoned investigator known for his integrity and dedication to justice. Detective Carter stopped a few feet away from the bench and held up his badge so Harrington couldn't miss it. "Your Honor," he repeated, his voice calm but authoritative. "Before you proceed further, I believe there are some facts about this case, and others that need clarification." The courtroom fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Harrington's face reddened, partly out of anger and partly out of unease. "Detective Carter, this is highly irregular," he snapped, attempting to regain control. "I'm in the middle of sentencing." "I understand, Your Honor," Carter replied smoothly, unfazed by the judge's irritation. "But justice demands accuracy, doesn't it?" With those words, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change the course of Marcus's life, and perhaps the entire town. Little did anyone know, the battle for truth was only beginning. Detective Elijah Carter stood tall, his badge gleaming under the courtroom lights. His presence was magnetic, commanding respect, even from those who didn't know him personally. The murmurs that had filled the room moments earlier faded into silence as everyone turned their attention to the unfolding drama. Judge Harrington's face flushed darker with each passing second, his grip tightening on the gavel as if it were a lifeline. "Justice demands accuracy," Detective Carter repeated, his voice steady and deliberate. He took another step closer to the bench, his eyes locked onto Harrington's. "For instance, Your Honor, did you know that Officer Grayson, the officer involved in this case, is currently under investigation for misconduct?" The words landed, like a bombshell. Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom, followed by hushed whispers. Some spectators exchanged shocked glances, while others sat frozen in disbelief. Even Marcus Johnson, still reeling from the judge's harsh sentence, felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. Could this be the turning point he desperately needed? Harrington's jaw tightened, his composure visibly shaken. "Detective Carter," he growled, attempting to mask his discomfort with authority. "This is neither the time nor the place for such allegations. If you have evidence, present it formally through proper channels." Carter didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folder, its edges worn from frequent handling. He held it up briefly before placing it on the edge of the judge's bench. "I assure you, Your Honor, these aren't mere allegations. This file contains documented complaints against Officer Grayson, complaints of racial profiling and excessive force. Complaints filed not just by Mr. Johnson but by several other individuals from marginalized communities. The courtroom buzzed again, louder this time. People leaned forward in their seats, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the folder. Ms. Reynolds, Marcus's attorney, perked up, sensing an opportunity to challenge the unfair ruling. She scribbled something quickly on her legal pad and passed it to Marcus, whispering, "Stay calm, this could work in our favor." Judge Harrington stared at the folder as though it might bite him. His usual confidence wavered, replaced by a mix of anger and unease. "These documents," he stammered. "They're irrelevant to today's proceedings. We're here to address Mr. Johnson's actions, not launch a witch hunt against one of our finest officers." "A witch hunt?" Carter raised an eyebrow, his tone laced with skepticism. "Or an overdue reckoning? Let's not forget, Your Honor, that Mr. Johnson's so-called resistance amounted to nothing more than asking why he was being searched without probable cause, a question any citizen has the right to ask." Harrington slammed his gavel once, twice, trying to regain control of the room. "Enough," he barked, his voice trembling slightly. "Court is adjourned until next week. I'll review the materials provided by Detective Carter and make a decision then." But Carter wasn't finished. Before Harrington could rise from his seat, the detective added one final statement, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "And let's not overlook your own record, Your Honor." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "A disproportionate number of harsh sentences handed down to defendants of color suggests bias, not impartiality. Justice must be blind, but it seems yours wears tinted glasses." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambled to jot down notes, while members of the audience whispered furiously among themselves. Some cheered quietly, emboldened by Carter's boldness, while others shot disapproving glares at the detective. Harrington's face turned crimson, his knuckles white as he gripped the gavel. For the first time in years, he looked vulnerable, exposed. As order was slowly restored, Harrington dismissed the court with a curt nod, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. He exited the room swiftly, his robes billowing behind him like a storm cloud. The crowd lingered, buzzing with excitement and speculation. Marcus, still standing near the defendant's table, felt a surge of gratitude wash over him. He approached Detective Carter, extending his hand hesitantly. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what else to say." Carter accepted the handshake firmly, offering a small smile. "You don't have to thank me, son. It's my job to ensure justice is served. But remember this: change doesn't happen overnight. Stay strong and keep fighting for what's right." Outside the courthouse, news of the confrontation spread rapidly. By mid-afternoon, social media platforms were ablaze with posts about the incident. Videos of Carter challenging Harrington went viral, sparking conversations about systemic racism and police accountability. Local activists seized the moment, organizing protests outside the courthouse to demand transparency and reform. Signs, reading "Justice for Marcus" and "End Racial Profiling Now," dotted the streets, carried by demonstrators of all ages and backgrounds. Back inside the courthouse, tensions simmered as preparations began for the next hearing. Lawyers huddled in corners, strategizing their next moves. Reporters camped out in the hallway, eager to capture every detail of the unfolding story. Meanwhile, Marcus returned home to find his phone flooded with messages of support from friends, family, and even strangers who had seen the news. His mother embraced him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "We're going to get through this," she whispered, her voice trembling yet resolute. "God doesn't let his children suffer forever." As the days passed, anticipation grew. The upcoming hearing promised to be explosive, with both sides digging deep to present their cases. Ms. Reynolds worked tirelessly, reviewing every piece of evidence Carter had provided and preparing Marcus for cross-examination. She reminded him repeatedly to stay composed no matter how heated things got. "You've got truth on your side," she told him during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "That's more powerful than anything they can throw at us." Meanwhile, Judge Harrington retreated into seclusion, avoiding public appearances and declining interviews. Rumors swirled about his mental state, with some speculating that he might resign rather than face further scrutiny. Others argued that he would dig in his heels, determined to defend his reputation at all costs. Officer Grayson, too, found himself under intense pressure. Internal Affairs launched a formal investigation into his conduct, interviewing witnesses and reviewing past cases. Friends and colleagues distanced themselves from him, wary of being associated with someone accused of such serious misconduct. Grayson, once proud of his position, now walked the halls of the police station with his head bowed, avoiding eye contact. Amidst the chaos, Marcus struggled to focus on his future. The possibility of jail loomed large, casting a shadow over his dreams of becoming an electrician. Yet he couldn't ignore the sense of purpose that had begun to take root within him. Inspired by Detective Carter's courage, he started attending community meetings, sharing his story and advocating for change. Slowly but surely, he realized that his voice mattered, that he had the power to make a difference. When the day of the next hearing finally arrived, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Every seat was taken, and people lined the walls, standing, shoulder to shoulder. Cameras flashed as reporters jockeyed for the best angles, capturing the historic moment. The air crackled with anticipation, a palpable energy that made it hard to breathe. As Judge Harrington entered the room, his expression was unreadable. Gone was the arrogance that had defined him. Instead, he appeared weary, almost defeated. He took his seat silently, avoiding eye contact with the crowd. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked its usual authority. "Let us proceed," he said simply, gesturing for the prosecution to begin. What followed was hours of testimony, debate, and emotional appeals. Witnesses recounted their experiences, with Officer Grayson painting a damning picture of systemic abuse. Experts testified about racial disparities in sentencing, highlighting patterns that could no longer be ignored. Through it all, Marcus remained calm, answering questions honestly and respectfully. By the time closing arguments concluded, the room felt charged with possibility. As the jury deliberated behind closed doors, Marcus held his mother's hand tightly, praying for a miracle. Outside, the crowd waited anxiously, holding candles and singing songs of hope. When the verdict was finally announced, not guilty on all charges, the courtroom erupted into cheers. Tears streamed down Marcus's face as he hugged his family and thanked Detective Carter once more. It was a victory not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by a broken system. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of the case continued to spread. Activists pushed for reforms, demanding accountability and transparency in law enforcement. Judge Harrington quietly retired, citing health issues, while Officer Grayson faced disciplinary action. And Marcus? He became a symbol of resilience, using his experience to inspire others to fight for justice. Though challenges remained, the town, and perhaps the world, had taken a small step toward healing. All because one man refused to stay silent when confronted with injustice. The days leading up to the next hearing were a whirlwind of activity. Marcus Johnson spent most of his time preparing for the trial, rehearsing answers to potential questions with Ms. Reynolds, and trying to keep his emotions in check. Despite the overwhelming support pouring in from friends, family, and strangers alike, Marcus couldn't shake the weight of uncertainty that hung over him. What if Judge Harrington refused to budge? What if the evidence wasn't enough to overturn the charges? These thoughts haunted him at night, making sleep elusive. Meanwhile, Detective Elijah Carter became a symbol of hope for many in the community. His bold intervention in the courtroom had ignited a spark that spread far beyond the courthouse walls. People admired his courage, not just because he stood up to a powerful judge, but because he did so knowing full well the risks involved. It was no secret that challenging authority figures like Harrington could come with consequences, especially for someone in law enforcement. Yet Carter remained steadfast, attending rallies, speaking at community meetings, and encouraging others to speak out against injustice. On the morning of the second hearing, the atmosphere outside the courthouse was electric. Protesters gathered early, holding signs that read "Justice over Bias" and "Hear Our Voices." Local activists distributed flyers detailing the case and urging attendees to stay peaceful yet vocal. Reporters from national news outlets joined local journalists, setting up cameras and microphones to capture every moment of what promised to be a historic day. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, a mix of excitement and nervousness rippling through the air. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Every seat was occupied, and those unable to find space sat on the floor or leaned against the walls. The gallery included not only Marcus's supporters, but also curious onlookers, eager to witness the outcome. At the front row sat Marcus's mother, her hands clasped tightly together as she whispered prayers under her breath. Beside her was Marcus himself, dressed once again in his navy blue suit, looking both determined and exhausted. When Judge Harrington entered the room, he moved slower than usual, his usual swagger replaced by cautious steps. His face was pale, and dark circles shadowed his eyes, suggesting sleepless nights. He took his seat without glancing at the audience, avoiding eye contact altogether. For the first time, he seemed diminished, a stark contrast to the domineering figure who had mocked Marcus during the previous hearing. As proceedings began, the prosecution presented its case, relying heavily on Officer Grayson's testimony. Grayson, visibly uncomfortable under the scrutiny, recounted the events of the traffic stop in meticulous detail. He described Marcus's questioning as belligerent and insisted that his actions were justified. However, cracks began to show when Ms. Reynolds cross-examined him. She skillfully dismantled his narrative, pointing out inconsistencies in his story and highlighting discrepancies between his account and the dashcam footage. "Officer Grayson," Ms. Reynolds asked calmly, "you stated earlier that my client resisted arrest. Can you clarify what specific actions constituted this resistance?" Grayson hesitated, shifting in his seat. "He refused to comply with my instructions," he replied after a pause. "So, asking why you needed to search his car is considered resisting arrest," Ms. Reynolds pressed, raising an eyebrow. "It was the tone he used," Grayson shot back defensively, "and the fact that he didn't immediately step out of the vehicle." Ms. Reynolds nodded, letting the absurdity of his response sink in before moving on. "And regarding your claim of smelling marijuana, was any contraband found during the KO search?" "No," Grayson admitted reluctantly. The exchange drew murmurs from the crowd, further undermining Grayson's credibility. When Ms. Reynolds introduced the dashcam footage into evidence, it painted a very different picture of the incident. The video showed Marcus remaining calm and respectful throughout the interaction, even as Grayson grew increasingly aggressive. The discrepancy between the officer's testimony and the actual events was glaringly obvious. Next, Detective Carter took the stand. Dressed in his uniform, he exuded confidence as he recounted the findings of his investigation into Grayson's conduct. Using clear, concise language, he explained the pattern of racial profiling evident in several cases involving the officer. He cited specific examples where individuals of color were targeted based on vague suspicions rather than concrete evidence. Each example added another layer to the mounting case against Grayson. "Your Honor," Carter concluded, addressing the judge directly, "this isn't about singling out one officer. It's about exposing systemic issues within our justice system. If we ignore these problems, we perpetuate them." Judge Harrington shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly unsettled by Carter's words. When it came time for closing arguments, the prosecution struggled to counter the damning evidence presented by the defense. Their attempts to justify Grayson's actions fell flat, leaving the jury visibly unimpressed. Finally, it was Ms. Reynolds' turn to address the court. Standing tall, she spoke passionately about fairness, accountability, and the importance of upholding the principles of justice. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady and commanding, "this case isn't just about Marcus Johnson. It's about sending a message that everyone deserves equal treatment under the law, regardless of their race or background. Today you have the power to right a wrong and set a precedent for future generations. Her words resonated deeply, earning nods of approval from the audience. As she finished, the room erupted into applause, forcing the bailiff to call for order multiple times. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: not guilty on all charges. The announcement sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Cheers broke out and tears flowed freely as people embraced one another in celebration. Marcus hugged his mother tightly, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude. Detective Carter approached him, offering a firm handshake and a proud smile. Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers, chanting Marcus's name and waving banners. Cameras flashed as reporters rushed to interview him, capturing his emotional response. "I never thought I'd see this day," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "But I want everyone to know that this fight isn't over. There are still so many others out there who need us to stand up for them." In the weeks that followed, the impact of the case reverberated across the nation. News outlets covered the story extensively, sparking conversations about racial bias in policing and the judiciary. Activists seized the momentum, organizing marches and campaigns aimed at reforming discriminatory practices. Judge Harrington quietly retired, citing health reasons, while Internal Affairs recommended disciplinary action against Officer Grayson. For Marcus, life slowly returned to normal, but with a renewed sense of purpose. Inspired by Detective Carter's bravery, he threw himself into advocacy work, sharing his story to inspire others. He partnered with local organizations to educate young people about their rights and encourage civic engagement. Though challenges remained, Marcus knew he had made a difference, and that gave him strength to keep pushing forward. Change doesn't happen overnight, but sometimes a single act of courage can ignite a movement. And for Marcus Johnson, that movement started with standing up for himself and refusing to let injustice win. The verdict of not guilty on all charges sent a tidal wave of emotions surging through the courtroom. Marcus Johnson, who had spent weeks preparing for the worst-case scenario, felt as though a heavy weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Tears streamed down his face as he hugged his mother tightly. Her sobs muffled against his suit jacket. For the first time in what felt like forever, they allowed themselves to breathe, really breathe, without fear or dread looming over them. Detective Elijah Carter stood nearby, watching the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. He had seen many cases like this one throughout his career, but something about Marcus's story resonated deeply with him. Perhaps it was the young man's determination to stay calm and composed despite the odds stacked against him. Or maybe it was the way his case highlighted the systemic issues that plagued not just their town, but countless others across the country. Whatever the reason, Carter knew this moment mattered, not just for Marcus, but for everyone yearning for fairness and equality. Outside the courthouse, the celebration spilled onto the streets. Protesters who had gathered earlier now cheered loudly, chanting Marcus's name and waving signs that read, "Justice prevails and truth wins." Strangers embraced each other, united by a shared sense of victory. Reporters rushed to interview Marcus, eager to capture his thoughts on the historic ruling. Still overwhelmed, Marcus managed a shaky smile as he spoke into the microphones thrust toward him. "I never imagined I'd be standing here today," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "But I want people to know this isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. We can't stop fighting until everyone gets the justice they deserve." His words struck a chord with the crowd, drawing applause and chants of support. As cameras flashed and reporters scribbled notes, Marcus glanced around at the sea of faces surrounding him. Many were strangers, yet they shared a common bond, a desire for change. Among them were local activists, community leaders, and even some police officers who had grown disillusioned with the status quo. Their presence reminded Marcus that while progress might feel slow, it was possible when people came together. Back inside the courthouse, Judge Thomas Harrington sat silently in his chambers, staring blankly at the wall. The once imposing figure now looked frail, his usual arrogance replaced by shame and regret. Though he hadn't admitted fault publicly, the evidence presented during the trial had left little room for doubt about his biases. The jury's decision, and the public outcry that followed had exposed cracks in the facade he'd built over decades. Rumors swirled about his impending resignation, fueled by whispers from colleagues who claimed he'd become withdrawn and distant since the hearing. For Officer Grayson, the aftermath proved equally devastating. Internal Affairs launched a formal investigation into his conduct, reviewing past cases and interviewing individuals who had filed complaints against him. One by one, patterns emerged. Black drivers disproportionately targeted during routine stops, vague justifications used to justify searches, and harsher treatment compared to white offenders committing similar infractions. Grayson's reputation crumbled under the weight of these revelations, leaving him isolated within the department. Co-workers avoided him, fearing association with someone accused of misconduct, while supervisors distanced themselves to protect their own careers. As news of the verdict spread beyond the town, it sparked nationwide conversations about racial bias in law enforcement and the judiciary. Social media platforms buzzed with hashtags like Justice for Marcus and NUC End Systemic Racism, amplifying calls for reform. Civil rights organizations seized the opportunity to highlight similar cases, organizing rallies and campaigns aimed at holding institutions accountable. Even politicians weighed in, promising legislative changes to address disparities in sentencing and policing practices. In the midst of this whirlwind, Marcus struggled to adjust to his newfound role as an advocate. At first, he hesitated to step into the spotlight, unsure if he had the strength to carry the torch. But Detective Carter encouraged him every step of the way, reminding him that his voice could inspire others to speak up. "You've already made history," Carter told him during one of their meetings. "Now it's time to use that platform to make lasting change." With Carter's guidance, Marcus began attending community events, sharing his story and urging others to get involved. He partnered with local nonprofits to host workshops on civil rights and legal literacy, teaching young people how to navigate interactions with law enforcement safely. He also collaborated with activists to push for policy reforms, advocating for measures such as mandatory body cameras for officers and independent oversight boards to review complaints. Despite the progress, challenges remained. Not everyone welcomed Marcus's advocacy efforts. Some residents, particularly those resistant to change, dismissed him as a troublemaker seeking attention. Others argued that focusing on race only deepened divisions rather than bridging them. These criticisms stung, but Marcus refused to let them derail his mission. Instead, he leaned on his support system, his family, friends, and allies like Detective Carter, to keep moving forward. One evening, as Marcus sat on the porch of his modest home, he reflected on how much his life had changed in such a short time. Just months ago, he had been focused solely on finishing his electrician training and building a future for himself. Now, he found himself at the center of a movement larger than anything he could have imagined. The road ahead would undoubtedly be difficult, filled with setbacks and resistance. But Marcus no longer doubted his ability to overcome obstacles. If he could stand up to a biased judge and win, he could face whatever came next. That night, as he drifted off to sleep, Marcus thought about the ripple effect of his case. It wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about proving that truth, and resilience could triumph over prejudice. Inspired by Detective Carter's courage, he vowed to continue fighting, not just for himself, but for every person silenced by injustice. Little did Marcus know, his journey was far from over. Across the country, others were taking notice of his story, drawing inspiration from his bravery. In cities large and small, activists began organizing marches, demanding accountability from local governments and law enforcement agencies. Policymakers started drafting bills aimed at addressing systemic racism, citing Marcus's case as a catalyst for change. And in classrooms, teachers used his story to teach students about the power of perseverance and the importance of standing up for what's right. Though Judge Harrington eventually retired quietly, his departure marked the beginning of a broader reckoning within the judicial system. Calls for diversity training and stricter guidelines to prevent bias gained traction, forcing institutions to confront uncomfortable truths about inequality. Meanwhile, Officer Grayson faced disciplinary Action including suspension without pay and mandatory ethics courses. While some viewed these consequences as insufficient, others saw them as steps toward accountability. For Marcus, the fight became personal. He realized that true justice required more than individual victories. It demanded systemic transformation. With renewed determination, he threw himself into advocacy work, traveling to neighboring towns to share his experience and rally support. Along the way, he met countless others who had endured similar struggles, each with their own stories of resilience and hope. Together, they formed a network of allies committed to creating a better future. As the months passed, Marcus noticed subtle shifts in his hometown. Conversations about race and privilege became more open, less taboo. Community leaders worked alongside activists to implement reforms, fostering collaboration where division had once thrived. Even the police department began taking tentative steps toward transparency, hosting town hall meetings and inviting feedback from residents. Through it all, Marcus remained grounded, drawing strength from the people who believed in him. His mother often reminded him of the importance of humility, urging him not to forget where he came from. Detective Carter continued to mentor him, offering wisdom born from years of navigating the complexities of justice. And Marcus himself grew more confident, learning to balance his roles as an advocate, student, and son. By the end of the year, Marcus's dream of becoming an electrician finally came true. He landed a job with a local contractor, using his skills to help build homes and businesses in underserved neighborhoods. Yet even as he pursued his career, he never lost sight of his larger purpose. Every evening, after finishing work, he returned to the community center to plan the next phase of his advocacy efforts. Whether it was organizing voter registration drives or hosting panel discussions on criminal justice reform, Marcus poured his heart into making a difference. Looking back, Marcus realized that his ordeal had transformed him in ways he never anticipated. What began as a nightmare had turned into an awakening, a reminder that even in the darkest moments there is always light waiting to break through. And though the fight for justice would continue long after his name faded from headlines, Marcus knew he had played a part in paving the way for a brighter tomorrow, because sometimes all it takes is one brave act to spark a revolution. And for Marcus Johnson, that revolution started with refusing to stay. The weeks following Marcus Johnson's acquittal were a whirlwind of activity. His story had become a beacon of hope for many, shining a light on the cracks in the justice system that so often went unnoticed, or worse, ignored. From national news outlets to grassroots activists, everyone seemed eager to amplify his message. Yet amidst the chaos and newfound fame, Marcus remained grounded. He knew that true change required more than headlines. It demanded sustained effort, patience, and unity. Back in his hometown, life began to shift in subtle yet significant ways. The protests outside the courthouse evolved into organized community meetings where residents discussed actionable steps toward reform. Local leaders, once hesitant to address issues of racial bias, now found themselves compelled to listen. Even skeptical members of the town council attended these gatherings, their presence signaling at least some willingness to engage with the concerns raised by activists like Marcus. One of the most impactful developments came when the police department announced plans to implement new policies aimed at increasing transparency and accountability. Chief among these was the introduction of mandatory body cameras for all officers, a move sparked directly by Detective Elijah Carter's advocacy. Though not everyone welcomed the change, some officers grumbled about feeling monitored. The majority recognized its necessity. For years, communities of color had called for such measures, only to be met with resistance. Now, thanks in part to Marcus's case, progress was finally being made. Marcus himself became deeply involved in shaping these reforms. Alongside Detective Carter, he joined a newly formed advisory board tasked with reviewing police conduct and recommending improvements. At first, sitting across from law enforcement officials felt surreal for Marcus. Just months earlier, he had been on the receiving end of their biases. But as discussions unfolded, he realized the importance of collaboration. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but having a seat at the table meant he could help steer the conversation in the right direction. While Marcus worked tirelessly to effect systemic change, personal milestones also marked this period of his life. After completing his electrician training program, he secured a full-time position with a reputable contractor. The job allowed him to support his family while giving back to the community in tangible ways. Many of his projects focused on renovating homes in underserved neighborhoods, ensuring safe and affordable living spaces for families who needed them most. Each completed project filled him with pride, not just because of the work itself, but because it symbolized resilience and rebuilding. But even as Marcus celebrated victories big and small, challenges persisted. Resistance to change remained strong in certain corners of the town. Some residents accused him of stirring up trouble, claiming that focusing on race only deepened divisions. Others dismissed his efforts altogether, insisting that racism was no longer an issue. These criticisms weighed heavily on Marcus, especially during moments when exhaustion threatened to overtake him. Still, he refused to let negativity derail his mission. During one particularly tough week, Marcus received a call from Detective Carter. Sensing his friend's weariness, Carter invited him to grab lunch at a diner on the outskirts of town. Over burgers and fries, they talked candidly about the road ahead. "You've done incredible work, Marcus," Carter said, leaning forward earnestly. "But remember, you don't have to carry this burden alone. There are people who believe in your vision, people willing to stand beside you." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, appreciating the reminder. "I know," he replied after a moment. "It's just, sometimes it feels like no matter how hard we push, there's always another wall waiting for us." Carter smiled knowingly. "That's the nature of fighting for justice. Walls exist to be broken down, and every crack you make weakens the foundation. Keep going, you're making a difference." Their conversation reignited Marcus's determination. Returning home that evening, he resolved to focus on the positive changes already taking root. Across the country, similar movements inspired by his case were gaining momentum. In cities large and small, activists rallied around shared goals: ending racial profiling, implementing independent oversight boards, and advocating for equitable sentencing laws. Policymakers began drafting legislation aimed at addressing systemic inequalities, citing Marcus's story as proof that action was long overdue. At the same time, Marcus's advocacy work expanded beyond local boundaries. Invitations poured in, from universities, nonprofits, and civil rights organizations, asking him to speak at conferences and events. Though public speaking didn't come naturally to him, Marcus embraced the opportunity to share his journey. Each speech was an exercise in vulnerability, requiring him to revisit painful memories while emphasizing the importance of perseverance. Audiences responded with standing ovations, moved by his authenticity and courage. One event stood out in particular, a panel discussion held at a prominent university. Joining Marcus on stage were other advocates, each bringing unique perspectives shaped by their own experiences with injustice. Together, they painted a comprehensive picture of the challenges facing marginalized communities. When it came time for questions from the audience, a young woman raised her hand hesitantly. "How do you stay hopeful when everything feels so overwhelming?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Marcus paused, considering the question carefully before responding. "Hope isn't something you wait for, it's something you create. Every time you speak up, every time you take a stand, you're planting seeds of change. Maybe you won't see the results immediately, but trust me, those seeds will grow. And when they do, they'll inspire others to keep planting." His answer earned heartfelt applause, resonating deeply with everyone in attendance. Afterward, dozens of students approached him, eager to learn how they could contribute to the movement. Their enthusiasm reminded Marcus of why he kept pushing forward, to empower the next generation to carry the torch. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of Marcus's case continued to reverberate through institutions nationwide. Law schools incorporated his story into curriculums, using it as a case study on the intersection of law and social justice. Journalists wrote investigative pieces highlighting systemic inequities exposed by his trial. Even Hollywood took notice, with filmmakers expressing interest in adapting his story for the screen. While Marcus appreciated the attention, he insisted that any portrayal remain authentic and focused on the broader message of equality. Closer to home, Judge Thomas Harrington officially retired citing health reasons. Though he never publicly acknowledged his role in perpetuating bias, his departure signaled a turning point. A younger, more progressive judge replaced him, bringing fresh ideas and a commitment to fairness. Similarly, Officer Grayson faced disciplinary action, including termination from the force and mandatory ethics training. While some argued that these consequences weren't severe enough, others viewed them as crucial steps toward accountability. For Marcus, the culmination of these efforts came during a special ceremony hosted by the mayor. Standing before a crowd of supporters, Marcus accepted an award recognizing his contributions to the community. As he held the plaque aloft, tears welled in his eyes, not just for himself but for everyone who had fought alongside him. "This isn't my victory," he declared, his voice steady despite the emotion swelling within him. "It belongs to every person who has ever dared to dream of a better world. We're not finished yet, but together we're proving that justice is worth fighting for." The applause that followed was deafening, echoing far beyond the walls of the auditorium. Outside, fireworks lit up the night sky, celebrating not just Marcus's achievements but the collective spirit of resilience that had fueled the movement. As the festivities wound down, Marcus retreated to the quiet solitude of his porch. Sitting beneath a canopy of stars, he reflected on how far he'd come and how much farther he still had to go. The journey ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, fraught with obstacles and setbacks, but Marcus no longer doubted his ability to overcome them. If he could stand up to a biased judge and win, he could face whatever came next. Little did he know, his story would continue to inspire countless others, spreading hope and igniting action in places he might never visit. Because sometimes, all it takes is one brave act to spark a revolution. And for Marcus Johnson, that revolution started with refusing to stay silent. With each passing day, Marcus grew more confident in his role as a catalyst for change. He understood that the fight for justice was far from over, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. Together with allies like Detective Carter and countless others, he was building a future defined not by division, but by unity. A future where truth and fairness prevailed. The months following the ceremony honoring Marcus Johnson brought a renewed sense of purpose to the town. The award wasn't just a recognition of his personal courage, but also a symbol of collective progress. It served as a reminder that change, though slow and often painful, was possible when people came together with determination and hope. For Marcus, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where he could focus not only on his own growth but also on nurturing the seeds of change planted in the community. One of the most profound transformations occurred within the local police department. Under pressure from activists and newly implemented policies, the force underwent significant restructuring. Mandatory diversity training became standard for all officers, and an independent oversight board was established to review complaints against law enforcement. This board included members from various backgrounds, community leaders, educators, and even former defendants who had experienced bias firsthand. Their role was to ensure accountability and fairness, bridging the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. Marcus played a key role in shaping these reforms. His participation in the advisory board allowed him to voice concerns directly to those in power. At first, tensions ran high during meetings, with some officers resistant to criticism, but over time relationships improved as mutual understanding grew. Officers began attending town hall meetings, listening to residents' grievances, and working collaboratively to address issues like racial profiling and excessive force. These efforts didn't erase decades of mistrust overnight, but they laid the groundwork for healing. In addition to systemic changes, Marcus continued his advocacy work on a broader scale. Invitations to speak at events across the country kept pouring in, each opportunity allowing him to share his story with wider audiences. From packed auditoriums at universities to intimate gatherings in rural towns, Marcus inspired listeners with his message of resilience and justice. He often ended his speeches with the same words: "Change starts with us. Every act of kindness, every demand for fairness, it all adds up. Together, we can rewrite the rules." His influence extended beyond speeches. Inspired by Detective Elijah Carter's mentorship, Marcus launched a mentorship program aimed at guiding young people through challenges similar to those he'd faced. Called Pathways to Justice, the initiative paired teenagers and young adults from marginalized communities with mentors who could offer guidance and support. Many of these mentors were professionals, lawyers, teachers, and social workers who understood the importance of representation and empowerment. Through Pathways to Justice, Marcus also introduced workshops on legal literacy. Participants learned about their rights during interactions with law enforcement, how to navigate court systems, and ways to advocate for themselves and others. These sessions proved invaluable, equipping attendees with tools to protect themselves while fostering a deeper understanding of civic responsibility. One participant, a 16-year-old named Jamal, later credited the program for helping him defuse a tense situation with police during a routine stop. "I remembered what Marcus taught me," Jamal said during a follow-up meeting. "Stay calm, know your rights, and never let fear silence you." As Marcus expanded his reach, his family remained his anchor. His mother, who had stood by him through thick and thin, took pride in seeing her son transform into a leader. She often reminded him to stay humble, quoting scriptures that emphasized the importance of serving others without seeking recognition. "You're doing God's work," she told him one evening as they sat together on the porch. "But don't forget where you came from." Detective Carter, too, remained a steadfast ally. Though their paths occasionally diverged due to professional commitments, they stayed connected, checking in regularly to discuss ongoing projects and strategies. Carter continued to investigate cases of misconduct, using his position to hold institutions accountable. Together, they formed a formidable partnership, combining Marcus's grassroots perspective with Carter's insider knowledge to tackle systemic issues head-on. Despite the progress, challenges persisted. Some residents clung to outdated beliefs, refusing to acknowledge the existence of racial bias. Others resented the changes, viewing them as threats to tradition or authority. Tensions occasionally flared, particularly during heated debates at city council meetings. Yet Marcus approached these conflicts with patience and empathy, recognizing that fear often masked resistance. He believed that education and dialogue could break down barriers, even if it required time and persistence. One such conflict arose when the school district proposed incorporating anti-racism curriculums into classrooms. Opponents argued that such lessons would indoctrinate students, while supporters insisted they were essential for fostering inclusivity. Marcus joined the discussion, sharing his experiences and emphasizing the importance of teaching history honestly. "We can't move forward unless we confront the past," he said during a televised debate. "Ignoring racism doesn't make it disappear. It allows it to fester." Ultimately, the proposal passed, thanks in large part to Marcus's advocacy. Teachers received training on culturally responsive pedagogy, and students engaged in open discussions about race, privilege, and equity. Over time, these conversations helped create a more inclusive environment, empowering young people to challenge stereotypes and embrace diversity. On a national level, Marcus's case continued to inspire legislative action. Policymakers referenced his story when drafting bills aimed at addressing disparities in sentencing, increasing transparency in policing, and promoting restorative justice practices. Civil rights organizations used his testimony to advocate for federal reforms, urging lawmakers to prioritize equality over convenience. Even celebrities and influencers joined the cause, amplifying his message through social media campaigns and fundraisers. For Marcus, the growing attention brought both opportunities and responsibilities. He collaborated with filmmakers to produce a documentary chronicling his journey, ensuring that the narrative remained authentic and impactful. Proceeds from the project funded scholarships for underprivileged youth pursuing careers in law, education, and activism. He also partnered with authors to write a memoir detailing his experiences, hoping to reach readers who might feel isolated or powerless. Though success had its rewards, Marcus never lost sight of his roots. He still worked as an electrician, balancing his advocacy efforts with hands-on labor. To him, there was dignity in building something tangible, a reminder that no matter how far he traveled, he remained grounded in hard work and humility. On weekends, he volunteered at local shelters, offering free electrical repairs and mentoring residents interested in learning trades. By the end of the year, Marcus's hometown bore little resemblance to the divided community it once was. Conversations about race and privilege had become normalized, replacing fear with understanding. Families of different backgrounds attended cultural festivals together, celebrating traditions that enriched their shared identity. Police-community relations improved significantly, with officers participating in neighborhood cleanups and youth sports leagues. While imperfections remained, the town had taken meaningful strides toward unity. Reflecting on the journey, Marcus realized that his fight was far from over. Systemic racism wouldn't vanish entirely in his lifetime, but he believed that every effort counted. Each life touched, each policy changed, and each mind opened represented a step toward a brighter future. As he stood on the courthouse steps, one crisp December morning, surrounded by friends, family, and supporters, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. "This isn't my victory, it's ours," he said, addressing the crowd gathered for a year-end celebration. "Together, we've shown that justice is worth fighting for. Let's keep going because there's still so much work to be done." Applause erupted, echoing through the streets as fireworks painted the sky with bursts of color. In that moment, Marcus knew he had made a difference not just for himself but for generations to come. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, he walked it with unwavering resolve, knowing that courage and compassion could light the way. Because sometimes, all it takes is one brave act to spark a revolution. And for Marcus Johnson, that revolution started with refusing to stay silent.